In early 2025, the small town of Crestwood carried an image of safety and peace. Nestled between quiet forests and winding rivers, it was the kind of place people described as untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Families had lived there for generations, and neighbors trusted each other so deeply that front doors were rarely locked. Children played freely in the streets, and the rhythm of daily life was slow and predictable. That sense of security was the foundation of Crestwood's identity, but everything began to change when an uneasiness settled over the community. At first, it was just a rumor. Someone had failed to return home from a late shift at work. People whispered about car trouble or a short trip out of town, but when another person disappeared a week later, the whispers turned into genuine concern. By the third disappearance, fear gripped the town. Each of the missing people came from different walks of life: a young teacher, a retired mechanic, and a college student visiting family. None of them had enemies, none had any reason to vanish, and none left behind a clue about where they were going. Friends and family searched desperately, their voices echoing across quiet streets as they called out names that never received an answer. The police began patrols, but their presence only deepened the realization that Crestwood was no longer the safe haven it had always seemed to be. People who once left their porch lights off at night began keeping them on until dawn. Conversations in grocery stores, cafes, and churches turned heavy with suspicion and dread. The once lively town square grew quieter each evening, as though the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for the next person to vanish into the shadows. Investigators widened their search as panic deepened, and soon all trails of evidence seemed to point toward the abandoned hiking path on the edge of town. Long ago, the path had been a popular place for families, hikers, and nature lovers, but after a mysterious death nearly a decade earlier, it had been officially closed. Locals avoided it, describing it as cursed or haunted, though most dismissed those claims as nothing more than superstition. Still, when the missing individuals were all last seen heading in that direction, the coincidence could no longer be ignored. The trail itself had become overgrown, with thick vines choking the wooden signs and moss covering broken fences. The forest canopy blocked out most sunlight, leaving the area in a dim, unsettling gloom even during the day. Police officers marked off the entrance with tape, but search teams pushed further in, determined to find something that might explain the vanishings. The deeper they went, the stranger their findings became. Scattered along the path were crude carvings etched into tree bark. Some looked like circles, others resembled crude geometric patterns, and together they formed a sequence that seemed deliberate. None of the symbols matched known markings of hunters or surveyors, and their repetition suggested someone had placed them there with purpose. The unsettling discoveries didn't end with the carvings. Hidden in the brush, volunteers found torn scraps of clothing, but they were too weathered to determine who they belonged to. A broken flashlight was wedged between rocks, its battery missing. Every item raised more questions than answers. Some investigators believed the trail had become a gathering place for a secret group. Others insisted it was the work of one disturbed individual. What no one could deny was that the abandoned path had become the center of a growing nightmare. The investigation took a grim turn when a local hunter came forward, reporting a strong, nauseating odor drifting from a dense section of the woods not far from the abandoned trail. Guided by the smell, search teams combed through thick undergrowth until they uncovered a shallow pit concealed beneath layers of leaves and branches. Inside the pit were scattered belongings that once belonged to the missing: a cracked watch with its hands frozen at midnight, a sneaker with its laces tied neatly, and fragments of clothing torn as though by force. The absence of bodies made the discovery even more unsettling, as though the forest itself had swallowed the victims whole. Forensic teams carefully sifted through the soil, uncovering additional fragments that seemed placed intentionally, almost arranged to be found. The belongings did not appear randomly discarded. Instead, they were clustered in a way that suggested someone wanted to leave a message. The chilling thought spread that these weren't just traces of victims but deliberate markers, left behind as part of a larger plan. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators spotted small black devices strapped high on tree trunks. Hidden beneath branches, the devices were revealed to be cameras. Dozens were collected, each aimed toward the trail where the missing had last been seen. When the memory cards were reviewed, the footage sent shivers through everyone who watched. The recordings showed the victims walking calmly into the woods, their movements unhurried, their expressions strangely blank, as if in a trance. None of them looked afraid or attempted to turn back. Even more unsettling, there was no footage of them ever leaving the frame. One by one, they entered the dark path and disappeared into silence, leaving behind only questions that no one could yet answer. As investigators studied the recovered footage, a disturbing pattern emerged. In nearly every video, a tall figure appeared at the very edge of the frame. Always distant, always blurred, the figure lingered just long enough to be noticed before vanishing behind a tree or melting into the shadows. Dressed in dark clothing, with a face obscured by either a hood or the angle of the camera, the stranger became the central focus of the case. What unsettled authorities most was the victims' lack of reaction. None of them looked behind, none slowed their steps, and none showed signs of fear. It was as if the figure was invisible to them, seen only by the unblinking eyes of the hidden cameras. Investigators replayed the clips endlessly, searching for a clue in the way the figure moved. At times it stood unnaturally still, almost blending into the forest itself, while in other frames it appeared to shift forward in jerky, unsettling motions, as though each step was carefully calculated. Forensic analysis of the victim's belongings revealed faint chemical traces of a rare sedative, strong enough to disorient, but subtle enough to go unnoticed until too late. This finding suggested that whoever orchestrated the disappearances had not relied on force alone, but on manipulation, luring people into a vulnerable state before leading them away. Speculation consumed the town. Some whispered that a hidden cult had returned to use the trail for rituals long forgotten. Others argued it was the work of a single predator, someone who knew the forest better than anyone else. Authorities tried to calm the panic, but the evidence told its own terrifying story. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and walking among the trees, leaving behind only shadows and unanswered questions. Just as the investigation seemed on the verge of a breakthrough, everything began to unravel. When officers returned to the trail to collect additional evidence, the cameras nailed to the trees were gone. Every one of them had been carefully removed, leaving only faint scratches in the bark where the screws once held. The strange carvings that had covered the trees were no longer visible either. In their place, fresh wood had been smoothed over, as if someone had meticulously sanded down the marks overnight. It was as though the forest itself had been scrubbed clean, erasing every trace of the nightmare that had unfolded there. The sudden disappearance of evidence left authorities baffled and frustrated. How could someone dismantle an entire crime scene without being seen or heard? Patrols had been set up, cameras had been placed at the trail entrance, yet no movement had been detected. Families of the missing grew desperate, demanding answers at town meetings, but officials had little to give. The case file thickened with theories but thinned with leads. The investigation, once so promising, fell into silence, choked by the absence of proof. In time, the trail was closed off entirely, its entrance blocked with steel fencing and warning signs. Still, rumors spread of strange noises at night, soft humming, flickering lights between the trees, and the occasional glimpse of a tall shadow watching from the woods. Some locals swore that the forest had claimed its victims, and would continue to do so if disturbed again. By the end of the year, Crestwood was no longer the quiet town it had once been. It became a place defined by fear and mystery, home to one of 2025's most disturbing unsolved crimes, a story too haunting to forget and too chilling to ever truly explain.